People like you should stay invisible. That's what my manager whispered an hour before everything changed, and I believed him because I had spent my whole life perfecting the art of disappearing, moving quietly, speaking softly, keeping my head down in a place where voices were loud and money was louder, and tonight every table glittered with people who looked through me like I was part of the furniture until the doors opened, and the air shifted, not louder, just heavier, like the room itself knew to hold its breath, and someone near the bar muttered his name, Russo, and suddenly no one was laughing the way they had been a second ago. I didn't need to look to know who had walked in, because I felt it in the way my hands started to tremble slightly against the tray I was carrying, like my body recognized danger before my mind could catch up. But I looked anyway, because curiosity has always been my worst habit, and there he was, tall, composed, dressed in black like the night belonged to him, moving through the restaurant as if space rearranged itself to make room. And people did, they stepped aside without being told, without even realizing they were doing it. And I told myself not to stare, not to exist. But then I saw her walking beside him, smaller, softer, her silver hair catching the light, her expression calm, almost distant, like she was somewhere else entirely. And that's when I noticed something no one else seemed to notice. She didn't react to the noise, not to the clinking glasses, or the music, or the whispers that followed her son. She moved through it untouched, like sound couldn't reach her. And something inside me tightened, because I knew that silence I had lived in it once, learned its language when words weren't enough, when speaking out loud only made things harder. So I kept watching, even though I shouldn't have, even though my manager's voice echoed in my head telling me not to draw attention to myself, because attention in a place like this never ended well. And of course that's exactly when everything went wrong, because the tray shifted just slightly, the glass sliding an inch too far, my fingers reacting a second too slow, and then the sharp sound of crystal breaking against marble cut through the room like a mistake you couldn't take back. Every head turned, and for a second I stopped breathing, because this was it. This was how I lost this job, the only thing keeping my rent paid and my life barely together. I dropped to my knees immediately, apologizing under my breath, already feeling the weight of eyes, judging, calculating, deciding I wasn't worth the space I took up, and I braced myself for the voice, for the anger, for the quiet humiliation that always came next. But it didn't come, not yet, because in that split second as I looked up, my eyes met hers, not hers, and she was looking at me, not past me, not through me, but at me, with a softness that felt unfamiliar. And before I could think, before I could stop myself, my hands moved instinctively the same way they used to years ago, shaping words in the air where sound couldn't reach. Welcome, I signed slowly, hoping I remembered it right, hoping I hadn't lost that part of myself completely. And everything froze, the noise, the movement, the entire room seemed to collapse into that single moment where her eyes widened just slightly. And then something incredible happened. She smiled, not polite, not forced, but real, bright, alive, like someone had just handed her something she thought she'd never have again. And I felt my chest tighten, because I hadn't realized how long it had been since I'd seen that kind of joy up close. But the silence didn't last long, because I felt it before I heard it, the shift behind me, the presence that made the air heavier again. And when I turned my head just enough to see him, he was already watching me, not with anger, not with confusion, but with something far more dangerous, attention, the kind that didn't fade, the kind that changed things. And in that moment I understood something. I wasn't invisible anymore, and I didn't know if that was the best thing that had ever happened to me, or the worst. No one spoke, and that was worse than if they had, because silence in a room like that meant something had shifted, and I could feel it pressing against my skin as I slowly lowered my hands, unsure if I had crossed a line I could not see. And for a second I thought maybe I imagined it, the way her smile softened, the way her eyes stayed on me like she was trying to hold on to something fragile. But then she moved her hands carefully, slower than mine, but certain, and she answered me, and I forgot how to breathe, because I understood every word. Thank you, she signed, and it hit me harder than anything anyone had ever said out loud, because no one here had noticed her, not really, not the way I just had. And suddenly I became aware of everything again, the room, the people, the weight of attention turning into whispers that did not need sound to spread. And I realized I was still on my knees in the middle of broken glass and expectations I could never meet. So I scrambled to stand, my hands shaking as I reached for a cloth, trying to clean up the mess I had made, because that was my job. Fix it, disappear, pretend none of this mattered. But I could feel his eyes on me, still steady, unblinking, and it made every movement feel heavier, like I was being measured in a way I did not understand, and then I heard his voice for the first time, low, controlled, not loud, but it did not need to be stopped, and I froze, because people like him did not repeat themselves, and I slowly straightened my back, the cloth still in my hand, my heart beating so loud, I was sure everyone could hear it, even her, even though I knew she could not, and I did not dare look at him fully, not yet, because there was something in that single word that told me this moment was no longer mine to control. Leave it, he said again, quieter this time, but somehow more absolute, and I hesitated just long enough for my manager to rush forward from across the room, his voice tight, with forced politeness. Sir, we will take care of that immediately. She is new. She did not mean to interrupt, but he did not look at him, not even once. His attention stayed exactly where it had been from the beginning, on me, and that somehow made it worse, because I realized he had not been watching the mistake, he had been watching what came after. And that was not something I could take back. You, he said, and just that one word felt heavier than anything else in the room, and I swallowed hard, finally lifting my eyes to meet his, and I wished I had not, because there was nothing casual in the way he looked at me, no irritation, no dismissal, just focused, sharp and deliberate, like he was trying to understand something that did not fit into his world. Who taught you that? He asked, and the question landed differently than I expected, not accusing, not demanding, just precise, and I opened my mouth, but nothing came out at first, because no one had asked me that in years. No one here had cared enough to notice what I could do instead of what I could not, and for a second I felt that old instinct rise up, the one that told me to lie, to make myself smaller, to say it was nothing, just something I picked up somewhere forgettable. But her hands moved again, gently catching my attention, and she signed slowly, please do not be afraid, and that broke something in me, just enough that the truth slipped out. Before I could stop it, my brother, I said quietly, my voice barely steady. He could not hear when we were kids, so I learned so he would not feel alone, and the moment the words left my mouth, I wished I could take them back, not because they were wrong, but because they were too much, too real, in a place that valued control over honesty. But something shifted again, not in the room this time, but in his expression, subtle, almost invisible unless you were looking for it, and I realized I was looking for it. Because I needed to know if I had just made things worse, or if somehow, impossibly, I had done something right. And then his mother reached for his arm, her fingers resting lightly against his sleeve, and she signed something too fast for me to fully catch. But I understood enough. She was asking about me, and the way he answered her, not with words, but with a slight nod, told me everything I needed to know. He listened to her in a way no one else in this room listened to anyone, and that realization settled deep, because it meant the rules I thought I understood did not fully apply here. Not tonight, not with him. And then he looked back at me again, and this time there was something different in his voice, not softer, but more intentional. Stay, he said simply, and I blinked, because I did not understand stay where I asked before I could stop myself, and for the first time something almost like amusement touched his expression, brief, controlled, but real. Here, he replied, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world, you will serve our table tonight, and my heart skipped, because that was not how this worked, not for someone like me, not with someone like him, and yet no one argued, not my manager, not the other staff, not even me, because something told me this was not a request. And as I stepped forward, my hand still trembling slightly, I realized the truth. I had spent years trying to stay invisible, and in less than a minute I had been seen by the one person I could not afford to be seen by. I should have walked away, but my feet did not listen, and neither did my heart, as I stepped closer to their table, feeling every pair of eyes in the room tracking me like I had crossed an invisible line and could not go back. And the closer I got, the quieter everything felt, like sound itself was being pulled out of the air, until all I could hear was the soft rhythm of my own breathing and the faint clink of silverware that no longer sounded casual, but careful, measured, like everyone suddenly remembered where they were and who was watching in. I stopped just beside the table, my hands steady now, not because I was calm, but because something inside me had shifted into survival mode, the kind that did not allow mistakes twice, and I forced myself to look at her first, not him, because she was the reason any of this was happening, and she was already watching me again, her expression warmer now, curious, and I gave a small nod before lifting my hands slowly, asking if she would like water, making sure my movements were clear, deliberate, the way I had learned years ago, and she answered immediately, her fingers lighter than mine, but confident, yes please, and I felt something ease in my chest, because this part one understood. This was a language without pressure, without judgment, just connection, and I poured her water carefully, making sure not to rush, not to spill, not to give anyone a reason to remind me where I belonged. and when I set the glass down she touched my wrist gently, not enough to startle, just enough to hold my attention, and she signed thank you again, slower this time, as if she wanted me to feel the meaning behind it, and I nodded because I did, and then I felt it. His gaze still there, still focused, not impatient, not distracted, just present, like he was studying something he had not expected to find, and it made every movement feel significant, like even the smallest thing could matter more than it should, and I reached for the menus, my voice steady, as I began to speak out loud for him and the others while my hands translated for her at the same time, describing the specials, the options, the details I usually recited without thinking, but now every word felt heavier, more intentional, because I was aware of both worlds at once, the one that spoke and the one that watched in silence. And for the first time I realized how different they were, how much was lost in between, and when I finished there was a pause, not awkward, not uncomfortable, just full, like something had settled into place that had been missing before, and one of the men at the table cleared his throat quietly, as if unsure whether to break the moment, but he did, asking about a dish in a voice that carried respect, now not just for him but for the space around him, and I answered automatically, my training taking over, but I could still feel that shift, the way the air had changed, the way I was no longer just part of the background, and it was unsettling, because I did not know how to exist like this, how to be seen without shrinking. And then he spoke again, not to the table, not to his associates, but to me. What is your name? And it was such a simple question, but it felt heavier than anything else he had said, because names meant recognition, and recognition meant you could not pretend later that nothing had happened, that you had not noticed, and I hesitated just a fraction too long before answering. Emily, my voice quieter than I intended, and he repeated it once, Emily, like he was testing how it sounded, like he was deciding whether it mattered, and I told myself not to read into it, not to assume anything, because men like him did not ask questions without reason, and reasons like that rarely worked in favor of people like me. But then his mother signed something again, her eyes bright with interest, and I caught enough of it to understand she was asking if I would stay, if I would keep speaking with her, not just tonight, but longer, and my breath caught, because that was not part of this, not part of my job, not part of anything I knew how to navigate. And before I could respond, he answered her in a way I did not expect, his voice softer than before, not for me, not for the room, but for her, of course. And then his eyes returned to mine, and something unspoken passed between us, something that felt like a decision already made. Stay close, he said simply, and it was not a command and not a request, but something in between, something that did not leave room for refusal, and I nodded before I could stop myself, because I understood what that meant, even if I did not understand why. And as I stepped back, just enough to give them space, but not enough to disappear, I realized the truth I had been trying to ignore. This was no longer just a shift at work. This was something else, something that had started the moment I chose to raise my hands and speak in a language no one else in that room understood, and now there was no going back to being invisible, because he had said my name, and somehow that changed everything. I told myself to focus on the basics, breathe, move, listen, do not think too far ahead, because thinking ahead meant imagining consequences, and consequences in a moment like this felt too big to carry. So I stayed close, like he said, not hovering, not disappearing, just existing at the edge of their table where I could see her clearly, and she could see me, and every few minutes her hands would move again, small questions, simple observations about the room, the people, the way the lights reflected off the glass, and I answered each one, carefully matching her pace, not rushing, not simplifying, because she did not need that. She needed to be spoken to like she was fully there, and not everyone seemed to understand that except him, because every time she signed something to me his eyes would shift just slightly, watching not the words, but the way I responded, like he was measuring whether I respected something most people overlooked, and that realization settled deeper with every passing minute, because I began to understand this was not about convenience, this was not about me being useful for a moment, this was about something personal, something he did not trust easily. And yet here I was standing in front of him, answering in a language he could not hear, but clearly understood through her reactions, and the room had not returned to normal, not completely. Conversations had resumed, but quieter, more controlled, like everyone was aware of a line that had been drawn and no one wanted to cross it. And I caught my manager watching from across the floor, his expression tight, confused, unsure whether to intervene or stay back, because this situation did not fit into any rule he knew, and honestly neither did I, because I had never been asked to stay close to a table like this, never been included in a space that was clearly not meant for someone like me. And yet no one was telling me to leave, and that was almost more unsettling than being dismissed because it meant I had a place here even if I did not understand why. And then she asked something that made my hands pause mid-motion, her fingers slower this time, more careful, like she was choosing her words. Do you like working here? And for a second, I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was the kind of question no one ever asked me, not like that, not with genuine interest. And I hesitated because the truth felt too complicated to explain in a few movements, but she was still watching, waiting, and I realized she deserved an honest answer. So I nodded slightly, then signed. It is what I have right now, and her expression softened in a way that made my chest tighten, because she understood more than I had said. And then she signed back softly, you deserve more, and I felt that in a place I had been trying to ignore for a long time, because people like me did not think about deserving more, we thought about surviving what we had. And I swallowed that feeling down quickly, aware again of where I was, of who was sitting across from me. And I glanced at him, just briefly, and caught the exact moment his gaze shifted, not away, not uninterested, but sharper, like that exchange had meant something to him, too. And I looked down immediately, focusing on adjusting the placement of a fork that did not need adjusting, because I did not know what to do with that kind of attention, not from someone like him, not when it felt like he was seeing more than I was ready to show. And then one of the men at the table spoke again, asking for another bottle, his voice respectful, careful, and I moved automatically to fulfill the request, grateful for something normal, something I could control. And as I poured the wine, I noticed something else, something small but impossible to ignore. No one interrupted her when she signed, no one rushed her, no one dismissed her like I had seen happen in other places with other people. And I realized that was not accidental, that was him, that was the kind of space he created for her. And it changed the way I saw him, not softer, not safer, but different, in a way that did not match the rumors whispered across the room. And when I stepped back again, he spoke my name once more, Emily, and I looked up before I could stop myself, because there was something in the way he said it, not questioning, not testing, just certain, like he had already decided something I had not agreed to yet. And for a second, neither of us said anything, but the silence did not feel empty. It felt deliberate, like the moment before something shifts again, and I felt it in my chest, that quiet warning that whatever this was, it was not temporary. It was not something I could walk away from at the end of my shift and forget, because he did not look at people the way others did. He did not glance and move on. He observed and remembered. And when his mother reached for my hand again, just briefly signing stay a little longer, I realized I had already crossed into something I did not fully understand. And the most unsettling part was I was not sure I wanted to step back out. Time moved differently after that, like every second stretched just enough for me to notice things I would have ignored before, the way his fingers tapped once against the table, not impatient, just thinking, the way the other men waited for him to speak before making even the smallest decision, the way she kept looking at me, not out of curiosity anymore, but something closer to recognition, like she had already decided I was not just passing through her world. And that realization stayed with me heavier than it should have, because I knew better than to assume anything in a place like this, where everything came with conditions I could not see. And still I stayed, because she asked me to, and because he allowed it. And those two things together felt more powerful than any rule my manager had ever given me. And I tried not to think about what would happen when this ended, when the night went back to normal, when I returned to being just another server who kept her head down and her voice quiet. But something inside me knew it would not be that simple anymore, because he had said my name more than once, and people like him did not repeat things that did not matter. And then the conversation at the table shifted again, quieter, more private, and I stepped back just enough to give them space, my hands resting lightly at my sides, ready if she needed me, but trying not to intrude, because I understood boundaries, even if I did not fully understand this one. And that is when I felt it, my manager at my shoulder, his presence tense, controlled, the way it always was when something unpredictable happened. Emily, he whispered low enough that only I could hear. What are you doing? And I swallowed, because I did not have an answer that would make sense in his world or mine. I am just helping, I said quietly, keeping my eyes forward, because turning away now felt wrong. And he exhaled slowly, like he was trying to decide whether to pull me back or let this play out. And for a moment, I thought he would step and tell me to leave, remind me of my place. But then he looked past me at the table at him, and something in his expression changed, not fear, not exactly, but understanding, and he stepped back just enough for me to breathe again. Stay sharp, he muttered before walking away, and I realized then that even he was adjusting to whatever this was becoming, and that made it more real than anything else, because if he was not stopping it, then maybe this was not a mistake, maybe this was something intentional, something allowed. And that thought settled uneasily in my chest, because being allowed into a space like this meant expectations I did not yet understand. And then she signed again, pulling my attention back, gently asking about my family, simple questions. Where are they? Do you see them often? And I hesitated, because this part was harder. This part was not just language, it was memory, and I felt it rise up before I could stop at the image of my brother laughing, without sound, the way we used to sit at the kitchen table communicating in silence, because it was easier than explaining to the world why we were different. And I answered her slowly, choosing my words carefully. He moved away. I do not see him much anymore. And her expression softened again, that same quiet understanding, and she signed back, life separates people, but it does not erase what you gave them. And I felt that deeper than I expected, because I had spent so long thinking that part of my life had been left behind, that it no longer mattered, and yet here I was using it in a place I never imagined, speaking for someone who needed it just as much. And when I glanced at him again, I saw it clearly this time. He was not just watching me, he was listening through her, through the way she responded, through the way the space between us had changed, and it made me realize something that sent a quiet chill through me. This was not accidental. He had noticed everything from the moment I moved my hands the first time, and he had made a decision based on that, and I was now standing inside that decision, whether I understood it or not. And then he spoke again, my name, steady, deliberate, Emily, and I looked up, meeting his gaze fully this time, because I knew better than to avoid it now, and he held it for a second longer than before, not threatening, not cold, just certain, like he was confirming something to himself. And then he said something that shifted the ground beneath me in a way I could not ignore. You are not finishing your shift tonight, and my breath caught. Because that was not a suggestion, not a question, and not something I could easily refuse, and for a moment I forgot how to respond, because leaving early meant breaking rules, meant consequences, meant explanations I did not have. But the way he said it told me something else. This was not about the job anymore. This was about something bigger, something I had stepped into. The moment I chose to speak in a language no one else in that room understood, and as I stood there caught between the life I knew and something I did not, I realized the truth I had been trying not to face. This night was not something I could return from unchanged, because he had already decided I was part of it. And for the first time I did not know if I should be afraid or curious. I did not move at first, because my mind could not catch up with what he had just said. Not finishing my shift was not something that happened, not here, not for someone like me. And for a second, I thought maybe I misunderstood, maybe he meant something else, but the way he was looking at me told me I had heard him exactly right, and the room felt smaller suddenly, like all the space I had been standing in had been taken away, leaving only this moment, this choice that did not feel like a choice at all. And I became aware of everything again, the weight of my uniform against my shoulders, the faint smell of polished wood and expensive cologne, the way my heartbeat sounded too loud in my own ears. And I swallowed, forcing myself to respond. Because silence now would not protect me. It is still my shift, I said quietly, not defiant, just honest, because that was the only thing I had left to hold on to. And for a second, nothing happened, no reaction, no interruption. Just that same steady gaze, like he was waiting to see what I would do with the space he had given me. And then his mother's hand touched mine again, soft, grounding, and she signed something quickly, her movements more certain than before. Stay with me. And I felt it again, that pull, stronger this time, not from him, but from her, from the way she looked at me, like I was not just helpful, but necessary. And that changed everything, because I was not choosing between a job and a stranger. I was choosing between walking away and staying for someone who actually needed me. And I exhaled slowly, realizing that this was the first real decision I had been given all night. And it was not about fear, it was about intention. And I nodded once, small but clear, and that was enough, because the moment I made that choice, something shifted again, not in the room but in him, his posture relaxing, just slightly, like a tension I had not even noticed had been released. And he turned his attention briefly to one of the men at the table, giving a quiet instruction that I did not fully catch. But the effect was immediate. The man stood, excusing himself, and within seconds the space around us adjusted, chairs repositioned, a place setting moved, creating room, without drawing attention to it. And I realized they were making space for me, not as a server, not as background, but as someone expected to stay. And that realization sent a quiet wave of uncertainty through me, because I did not know how to exist in that role, how to sit at a table I was meant to serve. And yet, as I hesitated, his mother gently gestured to the empty chair beside her, her eyes encouraging, warm, and I looked at him one last time, as if asking for confirmation I did not have the right to ask for, and he gave the smallest nod, not permission exactly, but acknowledgement, like he had already accounted for this moment, and was simply waiting for me to step into it. And so I did, slowly, carefully lowering myself into the chair, feeling every eye in the room shift again, even if no one turned to look directly, and I kept my hands folded in my lap, at first unsure what to do with them when I was not carrying a tray or pouring a drink, and for a second I felt exposed, like I had left behind the only role that protected me. But then she signed again, asking about the menu, asking what I liked, what I would choose if I were not working, and the question caught me off guard, because no one had ever asked me that here. No one had ever considered that I might have a preference beyond what I was told to recommend, and I hesitated before answering, honestly, naming a simple dish, something I could afford, something I knew well, and she smiled again, nodding approvingly before signing to him, something I could not fully follow, but I understood enough. She was telling him that was what she wanted, and he did not question it, did not suggest something more expensive or elaborate. He simply gave a quiet instruction, and it was done, and I realized then that this was how their world worked, not through noise, not through display, but through certainty, through decisions made without hesitation and followed without question, and it made me more aware of my own uncertainty, the way I measured every word, every movement, because I had learned that mistakes had consequences, and as I sat there caught between those two ways of existing, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not fear, not exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes when you realize you are being seen not for what you do but for who you are, and it was unsettling because I had spent so long hiding that part of myself. I did not know what it meant to have it recognized. And then he spoke again, quieter this time, almost like an observation. You are uncomfortable, and I let out a small breath that might have been a laugh if I had been less aware of everything around me. A little, I admitted, because there was no point pretending otherwise. Not here, not now, and he nodded. Once, like that answer made sense, like discomfort was expected and not something to be corrected. And then he said something that stayed with me long after the moment passed. You will get used to it, and I did not know if that was reassurance or a warning, but the way he said it told me one thing clearly: this was not temporary. This was not just a strange moment in an otherwise ordinary night. This was the beginning of something I had not planned for. And as I sat there beside his mother, speaking in a language that had once belonged to my past, I realized it had just become part of my future in a way I could not yet understand. It felt wrong to be sitting there, and yet somehow it also felt like the most natural place I had been all night, as if the moment I stopped trying to disappear, something inside me finally settled, and I could breathe again, not fully, not easily, but enough to notice things I would have missed before, like the way she leaned slightly toward me when she signed, as if closing the distance between us mattered more than anything else in the room, and the way he watched that small detail, not interrupting, not controlling, just observing with a quiet intensity that made me wonder how much he actually missed in any situation, and the answer felt like none, and that thought alone should have made me more careful, more guarded. But instead it made me more aware of myself, of the way I chose my words, of the way my hands moved when I signed. Because for the first time in a long time it felt like those choices mattered beyond simple communication. And then the food arrived, placed carefully in front of us by another server who avoided eye contact with me, like I had stepped into a space that made everyone else uncomfortable, and I understood that feeling because part of me still felt it too, that quiet question of whether I belonged here, or if this was just a temporary illusion that would disappear the moment I stood up and walked away. And I almost did stand up, out of habit, out of instinct, to return to what I knew, but her hand touched mine again, light, steady, and she signed stay present, and I stilled, because that was not just a request, it was a reminder, and I nodded slowly, letting that settle before picking up my fork, unsure if I should begin before them, until I noticed that she was already watching me, waiting not for permission, but for connection, and so I took a small bite, careful, measured, and she smiled again, as if that simple action had meaning I did not yet understand, and for a moment everything else faded, the room, the noise, the expectations, leaving just this quiet exchange that felt more real than anything else that had happened tonight. And then she signed, tell me something about you, not your job, not your duties, something real, and the question caught me off guard. Because I did not know how to answer that anymore. I had spent so long defining myself by what I did, what I needed to do to get through each day, that I had not thought about who I was outside of that, and I hesitated, my fingers hovering uncertain. Before I finally signed, I like quiet places, places where I can hear my own thoughts, and she watched me closely before responding, you found one, and I almost shook my head, because this place was anything but quiet. But then I realized what she meant, not the room, not the environment, but this moment, this space between us where I was not being judged or dismissed. And that realization settled deep, because it was rare, too rare, and I did not know how long it would last. And then I felt it again, his attention shifting, not away, not distant, but focused on the exchange, like he was learning something through it, something about me, or maybe something about her, or both. And I wondered briefly if he understood the exact words, or if he simply read the meaning in her expression, because either way it seemed to matter to him more than anything else happening at the table. And that was when it became clear to me this was never about convenience, this was never about filling a gap, this was about something far more personal, something tied to her, to the way she experienced the world and the people in it. And somehow, I had become part of that without meaning to. And, as that thought settled, I felt something else beneath. It's something quieter, but just as strong, a sense of responsibility, because being seen like this, being trusted like this, even in a small way, meant I could not treat it lightly. And I straightened slightly, my movements more intentional, not out of fear but out of respect. And when she asked another question about my brother, about whether he still signed, whether he had someone to talk to, I answered honestly, even when it was difficult, because she deserved that honesty, and because for the first time it did not feel like a weakness to share it. And as I signed the words, I realized something I had not allowed myself to think before. Maybe that part of my life had not been left behind, maybe it had been waiting for a moment like this to matter again. And that thought stayed with me as the conversation continued, as the plates were cleared and replaced, as the night moved forward in a way that felt both slow and inevitable. And then he spoke again, not interrupting, but entering the space with the same quiet control he carried into everything. Tell me, he said, his voice steady, his eyes on me, not demanding, but direct. Why did you stop using it? And the question landed deeper than I expected, because it was not about skill or memory, it was about choice. And for a second, I did not have an answer I wanted to give, because the truth was simple and complicated at the same time. I stopped, because no one needed it anymore. And saying that out loud, even in a room like this, felt heavier than it should have. And I held his gaze just long enough to let him see that answer before looking down again, because I did not know what he would do with it. And in that moment, I realized something that made my chest tighten. This conversation, this night, this unexpected shift, it was no longer just about her, or even about him. It was about me too, in a way I had not prepared for, and I did not know where that would lead. But I knew one thing for certain: there was no going back to the version of myself that had walked into this room trying to stay invisible, because he had asked a question that required truth, and now I had to decide how much of that truth I was willing to keep giving. His question stayed between us longer than anything else that had been said that night. Not loud, not heavy in the way people expect, but quiet in a way that did not let me escape it, and I could feel it settling under my skin as I tried to decide how to answer, because the truth was simple, but saying it out loud felt like opening a door I had spent years keeping closed, and I was not sure what would step through if I did. And for a moment I considered giving him something easier, something clean and forgettable, but the way he was looking at me told me that would not work, not here, not with him. And so I let out a slow breath and lifted my hands again, because some things felt more honest in silence than they ever could in words. I stopped, because life got loud. I signed, carefully, choosing each movement with intention, because it mattered now more than ever. And his mother watched closely, her expression soft but focused, as if she understood there was more behind that answer than I had said. And there was, because life did get loud: responsibilities, bills, long hours, voices that did not wait for you to keep up. And somewhere along the way I had learned it was easier to keep up than to stay in a world that required patience from others, and patience was something people rarely gave. And as that thought passed through me, I realized I had never said it out loud before, not even to myself, and something about that made my chest feel tight, like I had been holding on to it longer than I realized. And then she reached for my hand again, her touch gentle, steady, and she signed, "You did not lose it, you just hit it." And I felt that deeper than I expected, because it was true. I had not forgotten, I had just stopped using it, stopped believing it mattered in a world that moved too fast to notice. And then I saw it, the smallest shift in his expression, not dramatic, not obvious, but real, like something in what I had said connected with something he understood. And that realization made me more aware of him than I had allowed myself to be until now, because he was not just watching, he was listening in his own way, reading between every movement, every pause, every hesitation, and it made me wonder how much he saw in people how much he understood without needing words, and that thought should have made me more guarded, but instead it made me more honest, because if he was already seeing it, there was no point pretending otherwise, and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It felt complete, like the moment had reached exactly where it was supposed to, and for the first time that night, I did not feel out of place. I did not feel like I was borrowing space that did not belong to me. I felt present, like I was exactly where I needed to be, even if I did not understand why. And then his mother signed something again, her movements lighter, now more relaxed. "Would you teach me more?" And I blinked, because I had not expected that. "Not here, not like this." And for a second, I almost looked to him for confirmation without thinking, but I stopped myself, because this was her question, not his, and I nodded slowly, because the answer felt easy compared to everything else. "Yes, I can," and her smile returned brighter this time, like something had been decided, and I realized then that this was no longer just a conversation. It was the beginning of something ongoing, something that would not end when the check was paid or the night was over. And that realization brought a new kind of awareness, one that extended beyond this moment into something I could not fully see yet. And then he spoke again, his voice quieter than before, but no less certain. "You will," and it was not a correction, not an interruption, just a confirmation. Like he had already accepted what she had asked and what I had agreed to, and I felt that shift again, the one that had been building since the moment I first raised my hands. This was no longer temporary. This was no longer something I could step away from without consequence. And as I sat there absorbing that truth, I became aware of something else. The room around us had continued to move. Conversations resumed, dishes cleared, new guests arriving, but it all felt distant, like it belonged to another version of the night, one I was no longer part of. And I realized then that this table, this space between the three of us, had become its own world, separate from everything else. And that separation was both comforting and unsettling, because it meant I had stepped into something that did not follow the same rules as before. And then she signed one more thing, something simple, but heavy in its meaning. "You made this night different." And I felt my breath catch, because I had not set out to do anything extraordinary. I had just responded to what I saw, to what I understood. And yet here, it was something that mattered to someone who had likely seen far more than I ever would, and I nodded slowly, not trusting my voice to carry that weight. And when I looked up again, his eyes were still on me, steady, unreadable, but not distant. And for the first time, I understood something clearly. This was not about what I had done. This was about what I represented, something he could not buy, something he could not control, something that existed outside of his world. And that realization settled deep, because it meant I had value here, not as a server, not as a convenience, but as something entirely different. And as that thought took hold, I felt a quiet shift inside myself, a realization that changed everything. I had not been pulled into his world by accident. I had stepped into it the moment I chose to be seen. And now there was no going back to being invisible, even if I wanted to, because he had already decided that I mattered. And that was the kind of decision that changed everything. The moment settled into something quieter after that, not empty, but steady, like the kind of silence that does not need to be filled. And I realized I was no longer waiting for something to happen. I was already inside it. And that thought stayed with me as the table shifted again. Plates cleared, glasses replaced, the rhythm of the evening continuing around us, while our space remained unchanged. And for the first time, I noticed how intentional everything about him was, the way he spoke only when necessary, the way others adjusted without needing instruction, the way nothing around him felt accidental. And it made me more aware of my own presence here, because I was the only thing in this space that had not been planned, and yet he had not corrected that, he had not removed it, he had allowed it to stay, and that was not something I could ignore. And then his mother leaned slightly closer, her attention returning to me with that same warmth that had started all of this, and she signed slowly, as if she wanted me to understand every word clearly. "Will you come again?" And I felt my breath pause, because this was no longer about tonight. This was about what came after, and I hesitated, not because I did not want to answer, but because I did not know what the answer would cost me. Coming again meant stepping further into something I did not fully understand, something that did not follow the same rules as my life outside this table. And I glanced at him without meaning to, because whether I liked it or not, he was part of that answer. And he was already watching me, like he had been expecting this moment, like he knew the question would come and was waiting to see how I would respond. And I felt that familiar pressure again, not forced, not overwhelming, but present, the awareness that whatever I said now would matter beyond this moment. And I took a slow breath, grounding myself before lifting my hands. I signed carefully, but I need to work. and it was the truth, simple, direct, the only thing I had to hold on to, and for a second neither of them moved. His mother studying my answer, his expression unreadable, and then she smiled again, softer this time, and signed, work is important, but so is being seen, and that landed somewhere deep because it was the second time she had said something that felt like it reached past what I showed on the surface, and I did not know how to respond to that, not fully. So I just nodded because that was all I could manage without saying too much. And then he spoke, his voice cutting through the quiet, not harsh, not demanding, but precise as always. You will not lose your work. And I blinked because I had not expected that response, not the certainty in it, not the way he said it like it was already resolved, and I felt that shift again, the one that reminded me I was dealing with someone who did not speak in possibilities, only decisions, and I hesitated because I did not know how to accept something like that, how to respond to a solution I had not asked for. And yet before I could find the words, he continued, you will choose your hours, and my heart skipped because that was not how my world worked. That was not something someone like me was offered, and I almost said that. I almost told him it was not possible, but the way he looked at me stopped the words before they formed because he was not offering an idea, he was stating a reality that had already begun to take shape, and I realized then that this was how his world overlapped with mine, not by asking permission, but by changing the conditions entirely, and that realization should have made me step back. It should have made me question everything. But instead it made me feel something unexpected, relief, not because I wanted to depend on it, but because for the first time someone had looked at the limitations I lived with and treated them as something that could be adjusted instead of something I had to accept. And that thought stayed with me as I sat there trying to process what this meant, not just for tonight, but for everything that came after. And then his mother signed again, her fingers lighter, almost playful. Now good, then it is settled, and I could not help the small breath that escaped me, because it felt like a decision had just been made around me, without me fully catching up to it, and yet somehow I had agreed to it anyway. And I looked at him again, this time more directly, because I needed to understand something, anything about why this was happening, why he was doing this, and he held my gaze without hesitation, without discomfort. Like this was the most natural exchange in the world, and for a moment neither of us spoke, but the silence said enough. It told me that whatever reason he had, he was not going to explain it, not yet, maybe not ever, and that uncertainty should have unsettled me more than it did, but instead it left me with something else, curiosity, the kind that makes you stay a little longer, ask one more question, take one more step, even when you know you should not. And as that thought settled, I realized something I had not allowed myself to admit until now. I was no longer just reacting to what was happening, I was choosing to stay inside it. And that choice meant something. It meant I was no longer just being pulled into his world, I was stepping into it on my own terms, even if I did not fully understand what those terms were. And as I sat there beside his mother, speaking in a language that had once belonged to my past and now felt like it was shaping my future, I understood one thing clearly. This was no longer just a moment, this was the beginning of something that would not end when I walked out of this restaurant. And the most unsettling part was I was not sure I wanted it to end at all. The night should have ended there. It should have returned to something normal, something predictable, where I stood up, thanked them quietly, and stepped back into the role I understood. But nothing about this felt like it was moving toward an ending. Instead, it felt like something was settling into place, piece by piece, in a way I could not fully see yet, and I became aware of it in the smallest details, the way his attention no longer shifted away from me between conversations, the way his mother continued to include me without hesitation like I had always been part of her world, and the way the space at the table had adjusted permanently to my presence, as if removing me now would feel wrong. And that realization stayed with me as I tried to hold on to something familiar, something that reminded me I still belonged to the life I had before this moment, but even that felt distant, like it belonged to someone else, someone who had not yet been seen the way I had been tonight. And then I felt it again, that quiet shift, the kind that comes before something changes, and I looked up just in time to see him reaching for his glass, his movements controlled, precise, like everything else about him, and he did not rush, he did not hesitate, he simply set it down again and looked at me. Emily, he said. My name, steady, deliberate, and I straightened instinctively, because there was something in the way he spoke that demanded attention. Without raising his voice, and for a second I thought he was going to ask another question, something about my past, something about what I could do, but instead he said something entirely different. Tomorrow, and the word hung there, incomplete, but intentional, like he did not need to say more, because he already knew I would understand, and I did, or at least part of me did. Because tomorrow meant this continued, tomorrow meant this was not just a moment. It was something ongoing, something that had already extended beyond the boundaries of this night, and I felt that realization settle deeper than anything else had so far, because it meant I was no longer deciding whether to stay for a few more minutes. I was deciding whether to step into something that would follow me beyond these walls, and I hesitated just long enough for him to notice, not because I wanted to refuse, but because I needed to understand what I was agreeing to, and he watched me carefully like he had been expecting that hesitation, like it was part of the process and not something that would change his decision. And then he added one more sentence, not louder, not softer, just clear: "You will come to my home." And everything inside me stilled, because that was not something I could easily accept, not something I could treat lightly, because this was no longer a shared space, no longer neutral ground. This was his world fully and completely, and stepping into it meant leaving behind any illusion of control I thought I had, and for a moment I could not respond, not because I did not have words, but because every possible answer carried weight I did not yet know how to measure. And I felt his mother's hand against mine again, steady, reassuring, and I turned to her automatically, because that was where I felt safest in this moment. And she signed gently, "You will not be alone," and I believed her. I did not know why, but I did, and that made the decision feel different, less like stepping into something unknown, and more like following something I had already started. And I took a slow breath, grounding myself the same way I had earlier, reminding myself that I still had a choice even if it did not feel like one. And I looked back at him, meeting his gaze fully this time, because if I was going to answer, I needed to do it without hesitation, without fear shaping my words. And I nodded once, small but certain, and the moment I did, something shifted again, not in him, not visibly, but in the space around us. Like a decision had just been confirmed, something that had been waiting for my response. And I felt that weight settle in my chest, heavier than before, because now it was real, now it had direction, and I had stepped into it willingly. And then he gave a slight nod in return, like that was all he needed, like everything else had already been decided long before I understood it. And the conversation moved on after that, not abruptly, not dismissively, but naturally, like this was just another part of the evening. And yet nothing felt the same anymore, because I could feel it under everything, the quiet certainty that tomorrow would not look like today, that whatever waited beyond this moment was already set in motion, and I would be part of it whether I was ready or not. And as I sat there finishing a meal I never expected to have, in a place I never expected to belong, I realized something that stayed with me long after the plates were cleared. This was not about being chosen, this was about choosing to step into something that would change me. And the most unsettling part was not the risk, not the uncertainty, but the fact that I had said yes without fully understanding why. The night ended quietly, not with a dramatic shift or a final moment that marked the line between before and after, but with something far more subtle, the kind of ending that does not feel like an ending at all. And I noticed it in the way the table slowly emptied, glasses cleared, chairs pushed back, conversations lowered into something more private, as his associates began to leave one by one, each of them acknowledging him with a nod that carried more meaning than any words could. And I stayed seated for a moment longer, unsure if I should stand, unsure if I should return to the version of myself that existed before I sat down here. And for a second, I almost slipped back into that familiar pattern of quiet exit, polite distance, invisible presence. But then his mother reached for my hand again, her fingers warm, steady, and she signed, "Thank you for staying." And I felt that settle deeper than anything else she had said, because it was not just gratitude, it was recognition. And I nodded slowly, not trusting my voice to carry everything I was feeling in that moment. And then I stood, carefully aware again of where I was, of the space I had occupied, and the way it had changed me in ways I could not fully explain yet. And I turned slightly toward him, because leaving without acknowledging him felt wrong after everything that had happened. And for a second we just looked at each other, no words, no movement, just that same quiet understanding that had been building all night. And then he spoke my name once more, "Emily," and I paused, because there was something in the way he said it that told me this was not just a goodbye, it was a continuation. And I waited, because I knew better than to interrupt that kind of silence. And he held my gaze for a moment longer before speaking again. "Tomorrow at 7, and the certainty in his voice left no room for confusion, no room for negotiation. And I nodded once, because I had already agreed to this, I had already stepped into whatever this was becoming, and pretending otherwise would not change that. And then he gave a slight nod in return, like that was all that needed to be said, like everything else had already been decided long before I understood it. and I turned, then finally stepping away from the table, from the space that had felt so separate from everything else in the room. And as I walked back across the restaurant, I felt every eye shift again, not openly, not directly, but enough to remind me that something had changed, not just for me, but in the way others saw me, and I did not know what that meant yet. I did not know how far that shift would reach, but I could feel it following me like a shadow I could not step out of. And when I reached the back hallway, the noise returned, suddenly louder, sharper, more familiar, and I leaned against the wall for a second, letting it all catch up to me, the conversation, the decisions, the way my life had quietly taken a turn I had not planned for. And my manager appeared a moment later, his expression unreadable, as he looked at me, not with frustration, not with confusion, but something closer to disbelief, like he was still trying to understand what he had just witnessed. "You are done for tonight," he said simply, and I nodded, because there was no point arguing, not when I had already been pulled out of that role entirely. And he hesitated for a second before adding, "Be careful, Emily." And the way he said it stayed with me, because it was not a warning about my job. It was something else, something deeper, and I nodded again, more seriously this time, before pushing away from the wall and heading toward the exit. And the night air hit me the moment I stepped outside, cool, steady, grounding in a way I needed more than I expected. And I paused on the sidewalk for a second, looking out at the street, trying to place myself back into the life I understood, the one that had clear rules, clear expectations, clear limits. But it felt different now, like something had shifted just enough that I could not fully return to it. And I took a slow breath, letting that realization settle, because there was no point denying it, not anymore, not after everything that had happened. And as I started walking home, my mind replayed the night in pieces, the moment I first saw her, the way she smiled when I signed, the way he watched everything without missing a detail, the way my name sounded when he said it, like it carried weight I had not given it before. And I realized something then, something that made my steps slow just slightly. I had spent years believing that being invisible was safe, that it protected me from expectations, from risks, from things I could not control. But tonight had shown me something different, something I could not ignore. Being seen was not the danger I thought it was. Sometimes it was the beginning of something that mattered. And as that thought settled, I reached my apartment door, my hand pausing on the handle, because tomorrow was already waiting for me, something unfamiliar, something uncertain, something I had chosen without fully understanding. And for the first time in a long time, I did not feel the need to turn away from it. I felt something else, something quieter, but stronger, curiosity. I did not sleep much that night, not because I was afraid, but because my mind would not settle. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same moments replaying with more clarity than before, the way her hands moved, the way his voice carried certainty without effort, the way my own name sounded different when he said it, like it meant something more than it ever had. And I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it, trying to fit it into the life I understood. But it did not fit. It refused to be reduced into something simple, something I could explain away. And sometime around 3 in the morning, I stopped trying to understand it and just let it be what it was, something new, something I had not planned for. And when the light finally started to creep through the edges of my curtains, I realized I had already made a decision. I was going to go, not because I had to, not because he expected it, but because I wanted to see where this led. And that thought surprised me more than anything else, because it meant I was no longer just reacting, I was choosing. And that choice stayed with me as I moved through the morning, getting ready in a way that felt different than usual, not rushed, not automatic, but deliberate, like every small action mattered more than it had before. And when I stood in front of the mirror, I paused longer than I normally would, not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because I was trying to understand the person looking back at me, someone who had stepped into something unexpected and had not stepped away. And I took a slow breath, grounding myself before turning away, because overthinking it would not change what came next. And the day passed slower than I expected, each hour stretching just enough to remind me that I was waiting. And by the time evening came, I could feel it again, that quiet shift that had followed me since the night before, the sense that I was moving towards something that would not leave me unchanged. And when I stepped outside, the air felt different, cooler, sharper, like it was marking the transition between what had been and what was about to happen. And I checked the time once more, 6:45, giving myself enough space to arrive without feeling rushed. And I walked steadily, not hurrying, not hesitating, just moving forward, because turning back was no longer an option. I had already decided that. And when the car pulled up beside me, I knew before the window even lowered that it was for me. The Kind of car you do not question, the kind that arrives exactly when it means to, and I paused for half a second, not out of fear, but awareness, because this was the moment where the choice became real, where I stepped fully into something I had only touched the edges of before, and then the door opened, and a man stepped out dressed in the same quiet precision I had seen the night before, his expression neutral, but not unkind. "Miss Carter," he said, and I nodded, because hearing my name like that still felt unfamiliar, like it carried weight I had not given it before, and I stepped forward without needing to be asked again, because hesitation now would only delay what I had already accepted, and the ride was quiet, not tense, not uncomfortable, just still, like everything had been arranged to remove distraction, and I watched the city move past the window, noticing how different it looked from this perspective, how the same streets felt distant when you were not walking them yourself, and I realized then that this was what it meant to step into another world, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but subtle in the way it shifted your position in it. And when the car finally slowed, I felt it before I saw it, the space, changing, the atmosphere growing quieter, more controlled, and when we passed through the gates, I understood fully this was not just a home, it was something else, something built with intention, with boundaries that did not need to be explained. And as the car came to a stop, I took one steady breath before the door opened again, and I stepped out, my eyes lifting slowly, taking in the structure in front of me, the scale of it, the quiet presence it held, and for a moment, I just stood there, not overwhelmed, not intimidated, but aware that this was where the next part began. And then I heard his voice from behind me, calm, certain, exactly as I remembered, "Emily," and I turned, because of course I did, because he did not need to raise his voice or repeat himself, he never did. And as I met his gaze again, I realized something that settled deep and clear. This was no longer about the night before, this was about what came after, and I had already stepped into it willingly. The way he said my name this time was different, not louder, not softer, but closer, like the space between us had narrowed without either of us moving, and I felt it immediately, the shift from observation to something more intentional, and for a moment I did not speak, I just stood there taking in the quiet around us, the kind of quiet that did not exist outside these gates. And I realized this was what his world felt like, not chaotic, not loud, but controlled in a way that left no room for uncertainty, and I straightened slightly, meeting his gaze fully, because I understood now that looking away would not protect me, it would only delay what had already begun, and he watched me for a second longer, as if confirming something to himself, before turning slightly, gesturing toward the entrance without a word. And I followed, because there was no hesitation left in me, not after everything that had led to this moment, and the doors opened before we reached them, not dramatically, not for effect, just precisely timed, like everything else here. And as I stepped inside, I felt it again, that quiet shift, the way the air seemed to settle differently, the way every detail had been placed with purpose, and I moved carefully, not because I was afraid, but because I was aware that this was not a place you moved through without intention. And then I saw her standing just beyond the entryway, her posture relaxed, her expression already brightening the moment her eyes found mine. And something inside me eased immediately, because she was the one constant in all of this, the one piece that made everything else make sense. And I stepped forward without thinking, my hands lifting naturally before I could stop myself. "Hello again," I signed, and her smile widened instantly, her hands moving in response, faster this time, more confident, like she had been waiting for this exact moment. And I realized then that this was not just important to me, or even to him, it mattered to her in a way that made everything else secondary, and that realization grounded me more than anything else had so far, because it gave me a reason to be here, beyond curiosity, beyond uncertainty, it gave me purpose. And as we spoke in that quiet language that existed between us, I became aware of him again, not distant, not removed, but present, just behind me, watching, not interrupting, not controlling, just observing in that same steady way that had defined everything about him. And I understood something, then something that settled deeper than anything else. He was not here to take this moment, he was here to allow it. And that difference mattered more than I could explain. And as the conversation continued, her questions more animated, her movements more fluid, I found myself responding more easily, the hesitation from the night before fading into something steadier, something more certain, and I realized I was not just remembering how to do this, I was becoming comfortable in it again, like a part of me that had been quiet for too long was finally being heard. And then she signed something that made me pause, not because I did not understand, but because of what it meant. "You bring calm," and I felt that settle in my chest, because it was not something anyone had ever said to me before, not in those words, not in that way, and I glanced at him instinctively, because part of me needed to know if he saw it too, if this was something he recognized, or if it only existed in her world, and he met my gaze without hesitation, his expression unchanged, but his eyes sharper, more focused, like he had been waiting for that realization to surface. And then he spoke, not to interrupt, but to add to what had already been. Said, "You changed something," and the words were simple, but the weight behind them was not, because they were not about the moment, they were about everything that had followed from it. And I felt that truth settle fully, now not as something I was still questioning, but as something I understood. I had not just stepped into his world, I had affected it in a way neither of us had expected, and that realization should have made me cautious. It should have made me step back, reconsider what I was doing here. But instead it did the opposite. It made me stand a little straighter. It made me meet his gaze without hesitation. Because for the first time I was not here by accident, I was here because I had something that mattered, something that could not be replaced. And as that thought took hold, I realized something else, something quieter, but just as clear. This was no longer just about her, or even about him. This was about what I had chosen to bring into this space, the part of myself I had hidden, the part one had believed no longer belonged anywhere. And now it was here, shaping something new, something neither of us had planned. And as I stood there between them in a place that had once felt completely out of reach, I understood the truth that had been building since the moment I raised my hands for the first time. He could control everything around him, but he could not control what I gave freely, and somehow that was the one thing that changed everything.